It's time again for Talking Trade, sponsored by MMAC's World Trade Association and Michael Best Strategies.
Welcome to Talking Trade. I'm Sandi Siegel, president of ME It's a pleasure today to introduce our guest, Matt Umhoefer. Matt is Wisconsin DOT's Economic Development Chief. He's been with the department for nearly 9 years and has held many positions related to freight movement and policy, connected and automated vehicles, and local program project delivery. Prior to joining WISDOT, Matt served as a U.S. Air Force officer and Defense Department analyst in Washington, D.C. So something I learned new about you, Matt. I didn't know you were previously with Department of Defense. And I personally had the pleasure of working with you as serving on the Freight Advisory Committee for the DOT, which has definitely been an honor and a pleasure. And we've had a lot of robust conversations about the state and how DOT supports the international community. So I'm looking forward to talking about that a little bit today. So I know you're very well versed on the state freight plan, which was created by the Wisconsin DOT. And we won't go into depth on it today. It's hundreds of pages long, I know. But maybe you can give us a little bit of background on the plan. And let's start maybe with the why Wisconsin DOT created the state freight plan.
Sure. Thanks, Andy, and my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So WISDOT had actually initiated development of a state freight plan in early 2015, but what really accelerated things was the federal government's passing of the FAST Act in late 2015. Among other components of the plan, of the law, the FAST Act required all 50 states to develop a state-specific freight plan and gave 10 specific items that states needed to cover. The carrot, if you will, for states to develop these plans was a new type of federal transportation funding that I think we're going to cover later. And at the time, the requirement was that each state would update their plan every 5 years. So going into 2016, the department accelerated its work on the plan, did a lot of public involvement and cleanup throughout late 2016 and 2017. And the United States Department of Transportation ultimately ended up approving WISDOT's plan in March 2018. So then in late 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, commonly referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, became law, was signed into law by President Biden. That law, which I suspect most of our listeners are familiar with, has spurred significant investment both here in Wisconsin and across the country over the last 2+ years. Relative to the state freight plan, the BIL added 7 new items that each state had to include and shortened the refresh period from 5 years to 4 following each state's next update. So we had begun work on our next iteration of the plan and worked on it throughout 2022 and was ultimately approved by USDOT in June of 2023. The current plan has 3 foundational goals: to enhance safety, security, and resiliency of our system, to ensure system preservation and enhancement, and to ensure systems mobility, operations, reliability, efficiency, and connectivity. So with the update period now at 4 years, we expect work will begin on our next update sometime in late 2025 or early 2026.
Thank you for that. Do you think it's fair to say, I do think all our listeners familiar with the infrastructure bill, got a lot of attention in the FAST Act. Do you think a lot of that got a bit of a jolt and fast track, largely driven by the supply chain meltdown in 2021?
Yeah, I would say, well, it's certainly possible that the COVID-induced supply chain supply chain problems rather influenced the development of the BIL. It's important to remember that the law is affecting other parts of America's infrastructure besides the transportation system. So earlier today, I was, reviewing the things the White House highlighted after the BIL became law. And yes, it will help repair roads and bridges. And yes, it will help upgrade our nation's airports and maritime ports to strengthen our supply chains, but it'll also help support public transit, passenger rail, electric vehicle infrastructure, clean drinking water, reliable high-speed internet, and the modernization of our power grid. So it was really that phrase, generational investment. I think really does hold true in this case.
And that's a pretty comprehensive objectives there. Maybe you can touch a little bit further on what are some of the other key plan components.
Sure. So our state freight plan has 9 chapters and 3 appendices. We include sections on stakeholder engagement, our freight transportation system's assets and the condition of those assets, a lot of the performance metrics that the department uses to measure ourselves, forecast for freight movement and the economic context within which Wisconsin's freight movement occurs. We had a chapter on key challenges like COVID, like the supply chain disruptions, and trends such as the continued growth of e-commerce and what does that mean for our infrastructure. We also had an assessment of our freight transportation system's needs, and we explained how we prioritize projects for funding. Perhaps one of the most important chapters in the plan is Chapter 7, Freight Policies and Strategies. That chapter lays out over 70 freight-specific policies organized mostly by mode that explain WSDOT's intentions in a variety of different areas. These include things as wide-ranging as implementing work zone and lane closure management strategies and tools to maintain safety and minimize the impact on travelers, to continuing to support locally organized rail transit commissions, to serving as a resource for freight data information.
Fascinating. I know amongst all those modes and the many things you talk about in e-commerce and so forth, that for years we've been hearing how the infrastructure hasn't kept up with all the extra trucks and deliveries and so forth on the road. And certainly the trucking industry seems to have had the perfect storm, not only with more demand, but a continuing trend of driver shortages and drivers aging out, which we hear a lot from the truckers we are working with here. Federal hours of service mandate, which of course is now more strictly enforced. And all of that, I understand is leading to not having enough available truck parking or safe truck parking. And I've heard some, really horrific stories from our friends in the trucking industry. So talk to us a little bit about that. And is there anything in the plan that helps address that topic in regards to, trucker safety and trucker parking?
So I would say the plan has considerable narrative related to truck parking. That's probably how I'd characterize it. In fact, an assessment of the state's truck parking facilities was one of the 17 items that was required by the federal government. I'd say we have a pretty nifty graphic that depicts the daily hours of demand for truck parking, the number of trucks that traverse key corridors, and the truck parking locations throughout the state. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at that graphic. Harkening back to that Chapter 7 on freight policies that I discussed earlier, in the highways and local roads section, we explicitly state that we will, quote, support an increase in the availability of truck parking and related infrastructure at state-owned facilities. Well, there was some news last week that helped exemplify exactly what we were talking about there. So last week, the head of the Federal Highway Administration was in Sparta to highlight and celebrate an $8 million grant that WSDOT we've just won in order to add over 50 truck parking spots to the rest area there. The work that WSDOT staff put into creating that grant application is one piece of evidence that shows what we are doing to improve truck parking in Wisconsin, evidence of us delivering on the policy statement. And then in addition to those at the Sparta rest area, we have identified additional locations throughout the state where we expect to add over 100 truck parking stalls in the future.
That's amazing. That's great. Well, as you know, I have a lot of interest in the intermodal services that are much needed here in the state of Wisconsin, to be able to support our importers and exporters and attract businesses that are doing international business here in the state. So does the plan address other components of the transportation system, like rail, maritime freight movement?
It does. It definitely touches on other modes of transportation besides trucks. We discuss tonnages and values that flow via other modes. We have modal overviews, which includes things like rail safety, the conditions of locks and dams on the Mississippi River, and intermodal and transload facilities. The plan also has quite a few maps, like the one I mentioned about truck parking, which show things like the railroads and pipelines that traverse the state. We also have modal forecasts for rail, water, and air freight in addition to truck-borne freight. These forecasts lay out the volume and value of tonnages we expect to see in Wisconsin in 2030 and 2050, and are based on data sets we purchased from nationally known market intelligence firms. And I add lastly, our freight trends and challenges chapter and freight system needs chapter lay out a number of issues that are germane to each mode as well.
Great. Are there any specific tangible benefits that Wisconsin receives from completing the plan that you can share with us, Matt?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So in addition to the intangible benefits that the department and the state get from having a framework to guide investment and process decisions over the next several years, completion of the plan allows WISDOT to access a certain type of federal transportation funds, as I mentioned earlier. These funds come from something called the National Highway Freight Program. And between federal fiscal years 2023 and 2027, we expect the amount of funds that are sent to Wisconsin to exceed over $130 million. And if you were to visualize where these funds will be expended in the coming years, they would extend from southeast Wisconsin near Milwaukee to western Wisconsin near Eau Claire, with a significant amount also being used in the Fox Valley along I-41 and on I-39 in central Wisconsin. In addition to the highway projects, we do anticipate on using some of the funds in federal fiscal year 2025 to help with a local road project at Port Milwaukee in order to help facilitate maritime freight movement in and out of that port.
Excellent. Matt, I'm afraid we're out of time. It was such a pleasure having you here on Talking Trade and to hearing, the highlights of the plan and all the work that the WISDOT's doing here in Wisconsin. So thank you, Matt, for joining us, and thank you all for joining another episode of Talking Trade.
Thank you, Sandy. My pleasure.
You've been listening to Talking Trade, sponsored by MMAC's World Trade Association and Michael Best Strategies.